Hello, Media Critique Chic followers. This is Borderline Latina, and I am taking over. Taking over with the current, latest, and/or greatest topics in the realm of social justice, mental health, sexuality, anti-racism, and more. And, as always, this is unscripted yet informed by education, experience, theory, knowledge, etc. You get it. Now let's get into it. This episode is kind of a difficult one for me, an uncomfortable one for me. And I think it's because it's something that I don't necessarily talk about often. My connection to the Asian American Pacific Islander or AAPI community. So this episode is talking about taking over that Asian fetish, but I want to talk about just the relationships between people in the Black community and the AAPI community, Latinx community, because I think it's important for us to have these conversations among people of color and how we kind of show up to support one another. So, a little background about me, just a little bit. I grew up on the East Coast in relatively more culturally and racially diverse communities than maybe other areas of the United States, especially where I live now, aka the South. Anywho, I think that I know that my upbringing and me being surrounded by people of different races, particularly immigrants of different generations, has definitely shaped my beliefs and values towards groups of people, other people of color, international people, immigrants. And it's actually really interesting to see me older now, living in less racially diverse communities. I get to see how much important it is to be surrounded by people who are different from you, people who are outside of your race, your culture, how important it is to have those experiences growing up. Because one thing that has stood out to me is seeing how uncomfortable some people are, particularly white people are, when it comes to being in groups that are different than them, people of color. You can really see that there's this discomfort from them. And that is definitely informed by where they grew up. A lot of white people grow up around white people, and it is not uncommon for them to not see someone of color until they're much older. And what I think is really interesting is that there is this kind of almost innate culture, although it is not innate, it's conditioned, it is socialized, to be uncomfortable and to fear the different. And so I see that especially now interacting with folks, particularly white folks who have not been surrounded by people of color or other differences. For today's episode, I'm focusing on race and culture, but that can apply to other different scenarios. So why am I saying this? Because being around less culturally diverse communities, I've experienced a loss. So let me hand it to you this way. I'm just going to give it to you straight what I typically do when I enter a new town or a city experience. I move or I visit the place. I feel like I'm not the only one that scans for other people like myself. So when I do a first scan, you look to see how many white people there are. There's usually a lot more white people than any other race or culture. But then I also look and I scan first for my Black folks, my Caribbean folks, my Latinx folks. Absolutely. And then I also scan, if I don't see any of that, I scan for AAPI folks as well, immigrants, and etc. And I go down the line. So I've noticed, and I've lived in cities where, one city in particular where usually in all the places that I've lived, up into where I'm living now, there's always been at least as many people of the AAPI community as Black folk and or Latinx folk. But it wasn't until I want to say one particular state that I lived in, which was on the East Coast, but is a kind of a swing state, but I lived in the more quote-unquote liberal side of the state. But anywho, that was the first time I experienced that there was a little bit less of an Asian community, a presence in there. And I felt that almost immediately, but it was like one of those things where I didn't want to go and be like, where all the Asian people at? You know? And it was interesting having an experience with a person. I was out, hanging out with some classmates, and one of my white female classmates says to me, I guess she looks out the window and she sees two people of Asian descent walk by, and she goes, wow, that's a lot of Asian people. Or like, this place has a lot of Asian people. And I was like, I almost wanted to say to her, like, those were the first two Asian people I saw in like months. So it's very interesting, and it could be for her, like, after learning, because we learned about our hometowns and the demographics of our hometowns, and a lot of times we don't have time to do this. We don't look up the demographics of our town, and so that was a very enlightening activity to do. And she was part of one of those people that had like maybe 80 or 90 or 95% white, and so for her that probably was a lot of people. But for me, I'm like, no, there should be lots and lots and lots more. So let's take it back to this topic of the Asian fetish, or, relationships with other people of color. I have been a consumer of Asian media for quite some time now, particularly in the international dramas. I have consumed, I want to say, since 2015. I've been a regular consumer of Asian dramas, particularly Taiwanese and Japanese, but mainly Taiwanese drama. And that was just me kind of seeing something on Hulu, and then one thing led to another, and then I got Vicky, and it was, from there it was. And definitely I would love to get into the K-dramas. I'm afraid to get into K-dramas. I've seen one or two, but I'm afraid once I start, I will probably have to quit my job. Because it's so good. Like, that's like a staple when you think of dramas, Asian dramas. I feel like K-dramas is like, people are like, you have to consume this. Yes, I completely agree. It has to be like an extended vacation or sabbatical before I can do that. So I've always liked watching those dramas. And as someone who is of my background and my ancestry, I have grown up listening to different languages. So I'm very comfortable with listening to like people that speak languages other than English that I sometimes can or cannot understand. And that's okay with me. I think that probably made it easier now that I'm looking back on it, on how easy it was for me to just consume international media. I mean, it was something that I was used to. I was used to people speaking different languages, mainly through music, but also through like, TV shows or movies and stuff like that. So it's pretty easy for me to jump into the international train. With the subtitles, obviously it made things easier for me because I wouldn't understand otherwise, but it was something that I enjoyed because that was something that I was exposed to younger, with Jamaican music, reggaeton, Spanish music, and all that. So it was something that I've been always exposed to. Anyway, going back to this. So that was kind of my main stint in international dramas, but I've also, in the beginning, earlier than that, not as much, but there have been a couple times that I've seen some movies or something, I try to balance it, maybe consciously or subconsciously, of watching, folks of color, TV shows and movies and stuff like that. I enjoyed watching The Joy Luck Club. When Crazy Rich Asians came out, I was excited because at that point I had watched, it was a couple of years of me watching consistently international dramas, and I like how it was refreshingly different tales in the kind of quote-unquote standard canned American films that you can think of. So I was really excited to have something domestic that I can actually go into a movie theater and experience it with someone, as opposed to looking on like some website. You know what I mean? I feel like sometimes it's hard to consume International stuff, because you have to go to very specific website, is not readily available. So why do I struggle with this Asian fetish? I struggle personally with the fine line of being someone who appreciates different cultures and wanting to engage in it. Particularly, I'm a fan of entertainment media. That's why I'm taking over this podcast. But I struggle with entertainment, enjoying the entertainment aspects of those different cultures and not fetishizing it. I feel like it is important for us to understand that when we're consuming these different types of media, it is a very specific focus. Even though we can have diversity in the casts, like say for American stuff like that, a lot of times it ends up on stereotypes and it doesn't tell the whole story. Just because we see these certain scripts play out or these shows play out in America, that doesn't mean that is like the way that most people date or many people date, right? So I kind of have to extend it to Asian media too, right? Like there are certain tropes that play out, and that doesn't necessarily, it's not reflective of how everyone feels or navigates the world. And there are certain aspects of the Asian media and culture, depending on what type of particular media you're consuming, that is very sexualized and very fetishized. And I would be lying if I didn't say, like, for example, let's talk about the music industry, consuming K-pop. I don't watch K-drama, but I definitely consume K-pop for probably almost 10 years now. Well, I'll just say the year. I think it was 2012, 2011 is when I started listening to it exclusively. I just want to say I knew about BTS years before they was popular now, so little brag. But just to say, even that, right, there, when it comes to K-pop bands, there is a specific type of like icon. Like you can see, like when you see a boy band member, they typically look a certain type of way, and that way becomes sexualized and fetishized. It's like, this is the person I want to consume and be, based on all these kind of stereotypes or beauty standards of like, this is what beauty is supposed to look like. And so I know that I definitely feed into that when I fangirl certain Asian pop stars or famous people, and I have to kind of step back and say, like, am I liking this person, for the way they look and the way that they could, they contribute to the world via arts and entertainment? Or am I saying that I like Asians because I want a specific look? It's one thing, and I was reminded by watching a video on YouTube about this, that we can't just say, oh, I'm not looking at you, I'm looking at your soul or something like that. It's okay to like someone because they're Asian, but Asian and something, right? Like, it's one thing, it's like, okay, you became friends with me because I'm Black and something, like you can't really separate the two. So it's like I kind of struggle with finding that balance, right? Like finding people attractive and stuff like that. But even so, I mean, the idea of finding particularly Asian men attractive is something like in American society rarely becomes a subject of a TV show or something on the media, right? For so many different reasons that I would love to get into the history of that. Asian men tend to be feminized, and seen as unattractive, and which is just terrible, right? That's that stereotype. And the Asian women, on the other hand, tend to be sexualized and pacified at the same time, like submissive. They're supposed to be seen submissive, but then they're also ultra sexualized too. And those are on stereotypes, right? That if we consume that, we just assume that the tropes that we see are main characteristics that everyone is. Then we fall into the trap of liking people because of these stereotypes and not who the person is as a holistic person. So how do we kind of overcome this? I think being exposed to and building relationships with people of different backgrounds, the more that you're kind of interacting with people, you can see that there is great diversity into how people identify within the same community. I talk about arts and entertainment because this is an arts and entertainment show, but in education and learning about other people's cultures is important as well. And that's a lot of work that needs to be done on your own and not relying on that person of color to educate you. And in light of all the terrible things that have been happening relatively recently when we think of anti-Asian violence because of the coronavirus. But, it would be very short-sighted to say that this is something that is just unique to now. I mean, historically, there has been anti-immigrant, anti-Asian violence, anti-immigrant violence, xenophobia is something that's been long-standing for the longest of times. And we have definitely seen, yes, a surge and an increase of anti-Asian violence, specifically in terms of coronavirus, COVID-19, because it's new, specific to these past 2 years. But the hatred and the racism towards Asian and other people of color has been long-standing. But I say this as a person who, I guess what my connection is, I mean, obviously an appreciation of the media and stuff. I'm a fan of arts and entertainment, so I'm going to see from different cultures because I think it's important for different people's stories to be seen and to be heard and consumed. I like educating and experiencing myself in different things and enjoying it. But I think it's also important to know that it's hard when you see something affecting a community. It's not just unique to that community, it's to all. And as someone that has been experiencing the, anti-Black and brown violence historically, this is affecting our communities. It's affecting people that we know. It's affecting us personally. I wouldn't want that to happen to anyone else. So it's two things, right? It's the I don't, and I feel like most people kind of gravitate to that first part. Like, well, I've seen it happen to me, or I know people that I know, my family members. In my community, I don't want it to be the same for other people. I would not wish that pain on anyone. But then also the idea that if this is happening to a specific group in our community, like that's a terrible thing. That affects us all. Just the fact that certain groups are being targeted for their specific identities in itself should be like something that is just like, wow, us as a community should be pissed off. And I think it goes back to self-interest. It goes back to white supremacy, white privilege, knock on these terms in the door. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot easier for people and in the majority culture to not pay attention to those things because they don't happen to them. It's very easy to not know or be aware because it hasn't happened to them. Out of sight, out of mind. But I think it's important for us as a community as a whole, regardless of your race and your culture, to understand that if people are being targeted for their specific identities, that's a terrible thing for all of us. Because then who is safe? That's one thing. But then also just the fact that human beings are hurting for their particular identities is something that should be alarming. There we go. That's the word. Alarming for all of us. So going back to this main idea, it's a complicated history, and it's something that I still navigate too, right? If I am attracted to certain aspects of people, is it because I'm attracted to certain tropes or stereotypes, or am I attracted to the person as a whole and everything that makes up them? So I still hope that I can be in my very different ways in my day job to be helpful to people of color. And then outside of my job to be someone that can interact with many different types of people, because I think that's how we bond and form communities. We can't just be sticking to the same people. First of all, I think that's kind of boring and short-sighted, right? We need to be exposed to different views of the world. I like acquiring knowledge. I like learning about different things, and it expands the way that we know and relate to others. So that is how I conceptualize this. And this whole thing may sound like a mess. And it is a mess because it's messy and it's sloppy, but human relationships are messy and sloppy. And I think if we have these conversations about these things, it'd be helpful for all of us. So that is my take on that. This has been Borderline Latina Takes Over. See ya when I see ya.